good morning, everyone, or good evening if you happen to be dialing in from North America. It's Deb Sparks here from the Centre of Excellence in Prescribed Burning, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Kevin Heers from the Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Florida. I had the pleasure of meeting Kevin and his team at a conference in Missoula, Montana, where they drew together in the space of 3 to 4 weeks around 20 researchers and about 6 or 7 fire crews, and they ran a burn in the forest just outside of Missoula, specifically so that the researchers could get some data. Now, the burn didn't go so well because it was a little bit wet, but they did manage to burn a patch of land. But what was impressive was the collaboration that came together in that small space of time and on that small burn. I was just blown away. Anyway, having said that, I shall just pass over to Kevin and he'll give you a little bit more detail about their collaboration processes and embedding research into practice. Thanks, Kevin.
Great. Thanks, Deb. Hope everybody can hear me all right. Good morning, where y'all are at. First, want to just offer I hope that everybody came through the past fire season okay. I know it impacted everyone on this phone, and we had in 2018 a very bad fire season here in the western United States, and I had the privilege of working with an Australian crew that came in to help spell us. We were simply out of resources as well. So it's a small world and one that connects us all. But thank you all for your help, and I hope that everybody here is recovering. Today, Deb has asked me to give a talk about a process called coproduction that we're using to attempt to expand our prescribed fire science in the United States and abroad. And I'm privileged to be able to talk to you about this concept. And without further ado, I think we're going to get kick off here. Let's see if I can move a slide. It would be unfair for me to take almost any credit here. My expertise for the first 25 years of my career was simply setting the woods on fire. And I had enough questions at the end of that period of time that I dedicated the second act to research. And I want to certainly start by recognizing just the myriad of collaborators, some that I couldn't fit on this slide, but particularly Los Alamos National Lab, my good friend and colleague Rod Lynn and his team, the U.S. Forest Service, which will have contributed staff from every research station across the country, as well as numerous managers to this talk and these events, and then a number of other institutions, including Robert Trincato at the National Prescribed Fire Training Center. So just want to make sure that everybody understands this is a massive collaborative effort in the United States to really push forward the science of prescribed fire through this process of co-production. But just to get started, a little bit about myself. I want to point out that the United States is obviously, just like Australia, quite big and geographically diverse, and we tend to give all the attention to our Western fire campaigns, particularly when fires are burning in California or large fires in parts of the Intermountain West. But I live here in the Southeast, which is truly the home of fire by acres and numbers of fires that particularly we set on purpose in prescribed burning. I, in fact, spent the last 2 days conducting 3 research burns for a number of the projects, collaborative projects, and so I literally just came off the fire line and jumped on the computer. I got my start in wildland fire, both fighting and setting fire for the United States Air Force. My home base was Eglin Air Force Base, which is a 180,000 hectare, and I'll try to make sure that I use English units throughout, 180,000 hectare forest in the Florida Panhandle. Eglin Air Force Base was known by its motto, it's not your typical ignition source. We had everything that was dropped, thrown, or shot out of an aircraft started a fire there. And so the United States Air Force depended upon prescribed fire to do risk management. It was already an innovator in ecosystem management, weaving researchers into its wildlife and endangered species programs, but we had not done that for the fire program. When I got there, my mentor, James Furman, who's still a collaborator now, was in the process of building one of the nation's largest and most sophisticated wildland fire programs. At our height, we burned almost 50,000 hectares annually, and we did it in some of the most complex airspace in the country. And so Eglin Air Force Base was really a fantastic place to cut my teeth and learn the art of prescribed fire, as well as really the needs to expand it. But over the course of my 25-year career in fire management, it's not debate. Prescribed burning is becoming increasingly complex. These are a number of fires that were set by my program at Eglin Air Force Base, a couple that were burn bossed by myself. And the modern landscape, absolutely, the 21st century landscape absolutely needs 21st century tools, technology, and science in order to continue to do what we do effectively and safely. And we recognize that need, but because prescribed fire doesn't come with the absolute danger of wildfire, we often give ourselves short shrift in research investment. So when I was at Eglin Air Force Base, I was definitely handed a lot of research, and oftentimes I looked at that research and I looked at myself and my capacity to do it as the cartoon on the left, where research and development invented fire. But I had the privilege of running across a team of fluid dynamicists in about 2004, 2005, and they were using complex physics, partial differential equations to resolve wildland fire and smoke management. And that was Phil Cunningham, and soon Rod Lynn became very good friends. And I realized that I wanted to get away from the research that was simplistic and not telling me what I needed to know, and really dive into disciplines that were not traditionally part of fire management, and certainly not part of prescribed fire management. And what that gave me, though, is an appreciation for an interface that's often not recognized in fire management, at least here in the United States. And a number of efforts in Australia have been spectacular in trying to overcome what I call the fire management science interface. Just like the wildland urban interface, this is a divide that's really important for us to recognize. As a manager, I recognize that we were a diverse group. Some folks had fire programs that were setting large tracts of land on fire with complex planning. Others were private landowners just trying to burn the back few acreage to keep a pine stand and fire fuel-free area behind their homes. But we typically were lumped into a single group as fire managers by researchers. Now, fire managers relied on experience. I mean, for addressing uncertainty. If I had seen what a fire had done under those conditions before, I had a set of slides that I could apply to the current situation or predict future fire behavior. But what I found is that a lot of my management colleagues didn't know what we didn't know, because we only knew what we experienced. Now, fire scientists that were communicating with us were also a diverse group, but they tended to get lumped by my management colleagues as another scientist. And they were very tools and recommendation focused. Their influence on management was paramount, and yet they didn't fully understand what constrained management. And with recommendations that came out of a lot of research, we ended up closing off decision space. It was important for managers to make those decisions and achieve objectives. But then it was also obvious that many fire scientists were quantifying the obvious, and that was a problem, because if science can't tell managers what we don't already know, it's not very useful. And so the result was that I saw limited fire science being used in management over those first few years. And we also have a policy trap here in the United States where we focus almost exclusively on the wildland-urban interface as the target of our fuel treatment. So we pick off the hardest areas, which means that it constrains the amount that we can burn. And while we burn quite a bit here in the southeastern United States, up to 5 million hectares a year, in the western United States, by focusing in on the worst, we never treat enough area to treat a landscape scale that actually reduces risk at a level that's acceptable. And all of the small treatments that we're able to do tend to get overwhelmed by the large fires we can't suppress. And this is not a fire science problem. The wildfire problem in the United States certainly is not a fire science problem. It's a policy problem. And yet prescribed fire offers us an opportunity to do something different. And yet what gets lost in translation along this fire management science interface is important, because in prescribed fire, science has a lot to offer, and yet managers tend to approach learning through experience, while scientists tend to approach learning through structured learning, set up experiments. The managers, we have to deal with the specifics of exactly the day that we're setting fire and what that means for achieving objectives and safely controlling the fire within the burn unit boundaries. And yet scientists are after a general worldview. They want to provide generality and often have a different view of what's risky and how those risks propagate past the individual burn boss. And of course, burn managers, prescribed fire managers, are inherently integrative. They have to think about all the disciplines simultaneously. There's a supercomputer sitting there making decisions on a fire, whether it's ignition pattern, dealing with the weather and the variation of that weather that day, the fuels that are in any given burn block. Whereas scientists tend to be disciplinary, and they tend to be right now even more disciplinary in the depth of their understanding. And the complexity of this wildfire and prescribed fire context that's growing exponentially every decade encounters disciplinary depth of a physicist or a meteorologist that is less capable of actually imparting good information for its application to management. And so in order to combat that, when I stepped back into research after a number of years in management back in 2016, the first thing I did was gather up all of my friends and willing colleagues from management and research and created the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium, which is a loose affiliation of people just simply dedicated to understanding how fire science can be applied to prescribed fire management and overcoming barriers that are present not just in the Southeast where I work and live, but in the West and even in the northern tier states that actually currently burn quite a bit. But we're dedicated creating this consortium of partners to bringing managers and researchers together to address problems of prescribed fire science. We actually initially started, just because that's essentially what I knew, was setting the woods on fire, by conducting annual research burn events as contextual opportunity to have a conversation. Here's a fire. Let's think about how it moves. Let's think about how it affects the ecosystem we're burning. And so we instantly became experiential right off the bat. And of course, we discussed really advancing fire behavior modeling for prescribed fire applications, smoke transport tools that could take into account the things that fire managers control on the ground, like ignition pattern, choice of day, how variation, diurnal or within the selection of the day affects smoke transport, and then marginal fire conditions. Many of our wildfire modeling tools that are assumed to work for prescribed fire were developed for the worst case scenario. Whereas as a prescribed fire manager, I need to be aware of the worst case scenario, but I need to plan for the most likely scenario in order to achieve a positive outcome. And we don't, for lack of a better term, are calling those marginal fire conditions, although I don't know that all of my prescribed fires would have been considered marginal. And lastly, we wanted to look at mechanisms for fire effects that linked the physics and heat release from fire to improve our prediction of ecological outcomes, which are so important to the application of prescribed fire here in the United States and elsewhere. This term prescribed fire science is something that we think we coined, but we possibly didn't. But what we really mean when we say prescribed fire science is a context of research and an application of management that focuses on fires we use to meet objectives. Because objectives instantly constrain how we want fire behavior to achieve an ecological outcome, this context of objective focus is really important. It also means that if we're focused on prescribed fire, we instantly, if we're going to be planning for or applying models, we need to be able to understand multiple fire line interactions. It's the way that we control heat release and those ecological or safety driven outcomes. And we must be able to relate that heat release to ecosystem response and safety concerns. One of the things that we have focused on as a group when we mean prescribed fire science is three-dimensional vegetation. In the United States, we've too often thought of forests and ecosystems, grasslands as fuel rather than as a three-dimensional depiction of vegetation. And most of our prescribed fire behavior models, again, come from the wildfire context, and they sit upon a two-dimensional representation of that vegetation. And today, my fire under a 25-mile-an-hour wind was lit for the purposes of understanding how a very thick forest adjacent to an open area was adjusting drag on winds coming across a burn unit. We know that three-dimensional vegetation characteristics are critical, and I'll show some videos of these in a bit, but we don't have a lot of models available to managers to predict them under a variety of conditions. Lastly, linking smoke transport to ignition and that marginal fire threshold to combustion. The word co-production is starting to gain quite a bit of buzz in the United States. I think it's something that we probably have all understood intuitively, but now, because the word's out there, we're starting to use it a lot as a way to describe this idea of engaging managers and scientists together at the beginning of the research process in order to ensure that the outcomes that we achieve have management application. And so, in the United States, pardon me while I quote myself, but until now, there's really been no organized leadership for advancing prescribed fire science. We tend to be very reactive. We focus a lot of research dollars, tens of millions of dollars on wildfires. And as I mentioned in the wildfire trap, it's not a science solution that we're waiting for over there. And yet prescribed fire science over the last several decades has been a neglected field. And so we just recently published a paper called Prescribed Fire Science, a case for a refined research agenda. And if anybody has any questions about sort of our group's thoughts on what really is a priority for prescribed fire science, it's available. It's an open source journal, Fire Ecology. But co-production as a model has three elements. One is credibility. If you're going to be talking to managers about a science solution, you have to have credibility. The second thing, we have to have salience. It has to be information that is important to the topic to be able to address. We can't have a model looking for, that solves, every problem. It can't, just because I have a hammer, every problem can't be a nail. And then finally, we have to have legitimacy. You have to be legitimately able to address the problem at hand. And those three criteria are sort of universally recognized in the social science literature now as being critical for any co-production efforts. So how we achieve that credibility, salience, and legitimacy of our research for managers is something that I'll focus on through the rest of the talk. Our co-production model really starts with the basic idea of shared experience. As I mentioned, when I first got to Tall Timbers, stepping into the research world after managing the woods for quite a number of years, I really emphasize the idea that in order to change the game in the United States, focus on prescribed fire as a solution, we had to have new players. And in order to bring new players into an area of focused research and conversation, we had to have some sort of commonality. And so shared experience became that bridge to achieve credibility along the fire line for many of my scientists who were trying to engage managers. We recognized that informal downtime was going to be required to build relationships between management and scientists. And so having a burn event that people just showed up for the fire, did an after-action review and left was not going to achieve that. We needed to have a substantive amount of time. And in this case, we usually chose about a week with multiple burn events so that we could actually engage with each other in those downtimes. We needed a way of getting new researchers, new disciplines, and especially young managers engaged with older and more senior folks in order to bring new ideas in and to give, certainly new young career scientists and managers an opportunity to sort of find a place in the community. And so we intentionally involved them in ways that I think have been pretty productive. And finally, we wanted to make sure that we did research while we were conducting fire together so that managers had a chance to ask questions. Why did you do it this way? What do you think the outcome is going to be? If you put a plot here or measured it this way, you're not going to achieve this. And that conversation became very dynamic. And of course, it gives us an opportunity, these burn events gave us an opportunity to demo emerging technologies and advance the research. But one of the things that we recognized early on, it was going to be a bottom-up approach. If managers want research that actually meets their objectives, they're going to have to lead. And they're going to have to engage up front, early in the process, and these co-production models give them an opportunity to do that. We, as Deb mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we've conducted a number of co-production burn research events. The first 3 were at Tall Timbers here in Tallahassee, Florida. It was nice, easy home unit. I've got a place that people can stay. We've got restaurants nearby. And we had an opportunity to pull off a burn event at the Continuum Conference. It was a large international conference held in Missoula, Montana, and Lubric Forest was managed by the University of Montana, about 25 miles outside of town. And the opportunity came to actually bring this traveling research management roadshow to that forest and give participants at the conference an opportunity to actually come out and see this concept in practice. And I would say that while the fire behavior wasn't extreme, there were objectives accomplished that day in Montana, and yet it was the only 5 acres burned that entire week in the entire state. It's our 3rd largest state, and only 5 acres were burned that week, and it was by a couple of Southerners walking up in there and helping them out. One of the things that we also have emphasized up front is that we need new solutions to old problems, and that's only going to come from a diverse community, intellectually, culturally, institutionally. And so we've made a deliberate attempt to try to increase our own diversity and provide folks who are walking into our groups and these burn events a safe place to really learn, experience fire. You know, if I want the knowledge of somebody that can solve Navier-Stokes partial differential equations, they may not have seen fire on the ground before, but that's okay, and we need to make sure that we're providing that safe learning space, and that's been an emphasis for us. We also allow for structured sharing with hip pocket talks. We ask everybody that comes to give a 5-minute elevator speech on what they do and why they think it's important to others. And whenever we have some downtime, if we're sitting around waiting for conditions to be right for the ignition that day, we'll have people pull out these hip pocket talks, and we'll just have a conversation in the woods or in the briefing room before we go out to give people an opportunity to share their perspectives. And our next burn event, in fact, the chief fire warden of New Jersey was at the burn event in Missoula, Montana that Deb attended, and he said, "Hires, we're doing this in New Jersey. I just need 2 years." And so we have been planning that, and that burn event will be in September of 2020, COVID-19 permitting. And we feel like this idea has really kind of caught on. We've started to get a lot of interest in both nationally and internationally in bringing these kinds of training events to managers, bringing the research community together to address regional problems of prescribed fire. And the Northeast, where we're going to be in September, has also been followed on by a request in the Great Lakes region of the United States and the northern central portion of the country to hold the next one in 2021. But one of the things that we were surprised at is that our little band of research and researchers and managers also came upon some funding to advance the science that we were discussing. The Department of Defense, again, my former employer, through a research and development program that I used to sit on, had a strategic fire investment plan that I helped to write. And when it came time to fund that plan, we had not only researchers that had been discussing many of these topics for a number of years, but we had managers willing to host them. And our group, our Prescribed Fire Science Consortium, was successfully able to acquire nearly $20 million over the last 2 years to advance funding of core research topics, most of them focused on prescribed fire, because that's what the Department of Defense depends on. And many of these topics were that I mentioned earlier were the focus of that funding. One of the efforts that has come from that is a prescribed fire modeling framework. And as I mentioned, we've got 14 projects, more than $20 million that has been acquired by the team. But this framework that I'll spend the rest of the talk on is a direct outgrowth of our conversations with the management community. And these elements of the framework are critical to their advancement and their application of the science. First, we definitely understand very little about predicting prescribed fire behavior, particularly the nuance of ignition pattern. When we started writing one of the grants, having an exceptionally precise definition of ignition pattern, what we found was lacking across the management community. We typically, in our burn plans, write, well, it was a grid pattern ignition like we'd set with a helicopter, or a strip head fire, or dash or dot patterns. And yet the rate of ignition and the depth of fire lines that we build, is almost unexplored. We knew that we needed to measure flow in and around these fires, and that flow is manipulated by managers constantly throughout the prescribed fire operation. And the variation of fuel properties is something, as I mentioned, we integrate all the time as burn managers out there in the field, but it's often that nuance of variation is smoothed over by research and modeling. And so we turned to Los Alamos, and one of my good friends and colleagues, James Furman, who hired me at Eglin Air Force Base back in the late 90s, had a project that he and Rod Lynn received funding for. So a manager and a researcher received $1 million to take research tools like coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling using supercomputers at Los Alamos. This is the model FireTech, and to put them into a series of training aids where we could actually use the latest and greatest technology and build simulations of ignition patterns under a variety of wind, atmospheric, and fuel moisture conditions. And so these, what they would call computational fluid dynamics tools, CFD tools, had not had any operational investment and were simply assumed to be research tools only. Well, by golly, we have the opportunity now to train off of these, and the video outputs from them have been a staple of the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium for a number of years. Actually, at this point, I'm going to see if I can run the first video. And I'll take a look at the questions as it's pulling up. The way that FireTech runs is it's got every thousandth of a second, it looks for coupled fire atmospheric behavior processes. So as there's a buoyant plume driven by multiple fire lines, as they coalesce and converge at the bottom of the screen in this ignition pattern, they create a convective core, and that core then draws air in all around it. We've taken the surface fuels away from the downwind side of this unit. The simulation, the wind is blowing from left to right, but the progression of the ignition up to the top of the screen is staggered because, of course, you don't want to fire in the first igniter in the grid. And so this is how we might typically light fires at Eglin Air Force Base, where I worked for a number of years. And the three-dimensional fuels used in this simulation came from our forest measurement and monitoring plots that my program led. And there's a question in the comments right now in the chat about how we incorporate 3D understanding of fuels into incorporation of LIDAR fuels. This model takes, it can be run at 1 meter to 2 meter resolution, and so every 1 to 2 meters we have to impute data on that, and I'll show you some additional video in a bit of how we derive inputs to these kinds of tools. Deb, if you want to try to run the same video, if we're able to get this video to run, one of the things that FireTech and WFDS, these couple fire atmospheric behavior models that run on supercomputers, what they're able to do is they produce wind vectors as well as heat fluxes at these fine scales, both time and space. And so this is a 2 meter grid. We're looking down on that. So the darker green circles are the canopy tops of a longleaf pine forest there at Eglin. On the right of the screen, though, you get every 2 meters a wind vector. Red is updrafts, blue are downdrafts, and the size of the vector is the strength of the wind. As you see the fire come together, that convective convergence of fire lines, we get massive updrafts. And along the periphery of the unit, let's see if Deb's got the screen share on, but at the bottom of that, you can see the in-draft dynamics. And we see blue downdrafts coming through flaming fronts. those are the areas where you're most likely to pick up spot fires, not where they're necessarily lifting up, but possibly right as we're losing that convective dominance, and the next big downburst can come through. These are three-dimensional wind fields, three-dimensional fuels, and they take about a day to run on the supercomputer. So they're not practical to do for fire planning, but in terms of giving a young burn boss a flight simulator, similarly to what we do for pilots in flight training, this is the application that would not have come about if we hadn't had managers saying, hey, supercomputer modeler, how can we apply your tool? Right, Deb, I'm going to take the slides back. Thank you. But we also, as Deb was giving me some prep material, are dealing with a lot of interest in smoke as it relates to fire in the United States, as well as what we've seen in Australia. These advanced tools, as you can see, can be manipulated to understand how we, to look at things that we control: ignition pattern, the rate, the pace, the number of lines. But we can also use them to look at particulate matter and smoke planning as it relates to how our ignition pattern or choice of wind day, or even adjacent stand condition, is it open or closed, affects the production and transport of smoke. Here is again the Eglin vegetation. This is a fire tech run. On the top, what we're calling marginal or prescribed fire conditions would be considered about average, even though we're running a single ignition line for this experiment. On the bottom is critical conditions, what we would consider as being wildfire conditions. They are same wind, same fuel, just simply much drier. What you're looking here on the right, Rod and his team, Alex Josephson, are able to look at particle size distribution. So if we're looking at PM 2.5, we can see that prescribed fire conditions produce much smaller amounts of PM 2.5 than our uncontrolled wildfire conditions. So that's an important point to make to the public. And then what's even more important is how it controls plume lofting potential. And of course we understand that the more intense the fire is, the potentially lower, higher it can loft particles into the atmosphere. But that initial lofting is a very high source of error in our smoke modeling. We can disperse smoke atmospherically easily, but the handoff between the near field plume dynamics and those dispersion models is what we're capable of getting at here with these fire tech runs. And here, just to show how the managers are working with the researchers to do the same thing. Here's a strip headfire grid like we saw in the previous simulation, and here is a dot pattern or a grid pattern with a helicopter ignition. And at least 5 lines into these simulations, you can see clearly the head fires are producing much greater loft, whereas we tend to think of helicopter ignitions, being able to produce a significant smoke column, but early in the grid, it takes time to build. And without that, the lofting is low. And so if you're choosing a grid pattern ignition on foot in order to, say, moderate the fire intensity, it's going to have a smoke lofting impact. And we can now start to work with managers to look at how sensitive those conditions are. One of the things that Rod has done is also look at prescribed fires and wildfire scenarios as it relates to large meteorological events. And I've got a video of this. We'll see if we can get it to play, of a simulation done in FireTech of a fire burning in front of a thunderstorm outflow boundary. We typically call these density currents, and whether it's a sea breeze or an outflow boundary, you've got a cool pool of dense air that's running along the ground at some velocity. Typically, for us, it's anywhere from 20 to 40 miles an hour. And yet, at the front, the leading edge of these, on fires that are impacted, prescribed or wild, by sea breezes or thunderstorm outflow boundaries, we can see wind velocities increase to 60 miles an hour. There have been a number of bad days at the office for me intersecting these. But where those gust fronts come from is not along the surface. It's actually this coupled fire atmospheric interaction process where you get a rotor that, because this cool, dense air rises up over a buoyant plume, has to necessarily drag high momentum air from aloft to fill that gap. It's just the physics of the model, but it's also the physics of the Earth. And so those rotors that are created by this buoyant plume intersecting a dense outflow boundary are creating now gusts up to 60 miles an hour in the simulation, pushing that fire forward very, very rapidly, and they can come in multiples. And so you've got, just as that first rotor gust has hit the fire, the second one's forming behind it. And later in the simulation, you can run it out, and that cool, dense air it stabilizes and may only be moving again at 20 miles an hour, but those gusts are coming from aloft. And so that application is something that's very management relevant to us in the Southeast, is just understanding sort of the processes that are governing critical fire weather for prescribed fire managers. And yet those are models that run on sophisticated, high-performing computing banks at Los Alamos or the Forest Service if you use WFDS. And the race is on to really create tools that have an intermediate level of coupling the fire to the atmosphere, but in realistic scenarios that can give us ignition pattern results. And Rod Lynn at Los Alamos, Scott Goodrick at the U.S. Forest Service developed a fast-running code, combustion code, coupled it with a Los Alamos product called Quick, which was developed for an urban dispersion environment by Mike Brown, and brought together a team of managers that included myself to help refine QuickFire as a fast-running operational prescribed fire planning tool. We published this in January of this year. So Lynn et al. 2020 describes this. We've been working with Jason Sharples down at the University of New South Wales on this, potentially to try to apply this to Australian fuels. But QuickFire captures the basic dynamics of these fire atmospheric feedback loops, but it does so in faster than real-time simulations on a laptop. And let me see if I can get one more video to play. And I'll show you, ironically, the best video I've got is hot off the press. It's a wildfire scenario, so it's not actually a prescribed fire, but it is showing the simulation of fire behavior moving from a line of fire initially up a complex slope that is from real topography and fuels in Arizona or in New Mexico around Los Alamos. The way that QuickFire moves, this is a 45-minute simulation. It ran on a non-souped up computer in just minutes, and you can see as the fire reaches the much wetter fuels at the top, the burning rate slows down. Fire begins to finger out, and as soon as we get shorter lines of fire, they move slower. And so this dynamic is this tool is able to capture these coupled fire atmospheric behavior dynamics in real three-dimensional landscapes on real three-dimensional fuels, the same fuels that are used on the supercomputer. And so we can double check these results from the QuickFire quick simulation back with the full fidelity physics model. And this was done, this tool literally was created with almost minimal funding, but at the demand of prescribed fire managers in the consortium. We've been working on this tool since 2015, and it's been a really one of the most impactful results from the consortium, that manager and researcher co-production process. Just to quickly maybe address some of the three-dimensionality, we actually are using a number of LIDAR and remotely sensed platforms to capture the vegetation. I mean, in fact, I'm trying to purge the term fuel from my lexicon. I'm trying to just say vegetation now when I refer to what's burning, because that's really what we're capable of thinking about now. We don't have to abstract it here in the United States to our fire behavior prediction system, Scott and Virgin 40 or Standard 13. You have always treated ecosystems a much more sophisticated way than we have, but even now with the advent of this kind of technology, we've got the ability to quickly grab three-dimensional aspects. This is one of our burn events in 2017. If we can get this one to play, it's been taking a little bit longer than the others to load, where we apply the laser technology, terrestrial laser scanning, given by the University of Montana, and Let's see one more time if it'll play. Give you some of the details of a scan. So this is a unit that we burned, and we'll turn around and then impute all those fuels into the supercomputer model and the exact ignition pattern that we use. And this is the level of detail now that we have to be able to populate those three-dimensional inputs to the modeling. Now we'll sum them up. It's actually more detail than the models used currently. We'll sum them up and apply them at a 1 to 2 meter resolution, although QuickFire can run down lower than that. It just starts to slow down just a little bit. Just quickly moving through, being able to take that though and create entire landscapes is the realm of Andy Hudak, one of our collaborators with the U.S. Forest Service and the Rocky Mountain Research Station. This is Eglin Air Force Base again, where I used to work on a project that was funded by the Department of Defense as we were building this team. And Andy's able to take canopy-informed airborne LIDAR, which has less information, obviously, than what I just showed you, and then make some estimates of fuel duct depth, fuel bed depth, as well as from the time since last burn, be able to create a three-dimensional depiction of the landscape. And from those, we can run something like QuickFire. In fact, I've just had a graduate student finish up, ran the unit here in the bottom left with QuickFire on his laptop, looking at the simulation of the ignition pattern from an experiment that we did a number of years ago. One of the things that managers have been really asking us to dive into, though, is fuel moisture content, particularly diurnal patterns, and how burning switches, the on-off switch that we use during the early morning hours, maybe to set the black line, get a baseline in, and then start our ignition pattern. So that transition from too wet to burn to too dry to hold is something that we're looking at, these threshold changes in moisture, especially as it relates to solar radiant energy throughout the day. We're also looking at fine scale gaps in fuel, both linear and oblong, clearly looking at spotting potential as fire behavior intersects lines of control lines is something of interest, and then relating that back to predictions of, say, crown scorch. One of the things that we've tried to work with managers on, and I've got this slide in here, primarily just to talk about the method, but this study came out of the initial burn event as well, is that we're trying to make available more sophisticated monitoring tools for three-dimensional analysis, and cell phones actually provide us that capability. A lot of folks are starting to use these to capture what they call structure from motion. We can actually use them now, as well as very low-cost LIDAR. This method is being tested by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners in our group, the Regional Fire Management Office there, at a number of refuges where we can go in and use really just kind of a high-tech but easy to use tools in order to acquire the data that can then run QuickFire, say, for operational applications. And this particular case, I put it in here because bark is so important to spot fire initiation in Australia, and yet we don't tend to think about it here. One of the studies that we were supporting in 2016 was Nick Skowronski's assessment of ember production, and what they found is in pine systems here in the eastern United States, both up in New Jersey and Florida, pine bark was the #1 source of embers that actually were burning at the time that they landed on the experimental capture units. They were using pans of water to capture these embers downwind. And so we started looking at flaky patterns in the bark, and noticed that bark temperature could actually correlate to the diurnal wetting and drying of bark in ways that made it not only available, not only much drier, but available for lofting by peeling it away from the bole of the tree. And when we pair that with wake eddy modeling, so as fires pass the bole of trees, you get the upward velocity of behind the tree, and fires can run up the backside of that tree. When you pair that with extensive drying now due to direct sunlight, we actually are wrapping up this paper looking at how the direction of fire spread relative to the sunny side of a bowl increases spot fire ignition probability. And again, that's a very management relevant question that you can tell came out of our group, just this collaboration between research and managers. And I'll leave you with a few other thoughts. One of the things that we really are trying to emphasize is understanding live fuels in ways that are ecologically relevant. This is a jet of water vapor that nearly extinguishes that candle. Carrie Yednak is about to publish this study looking at how live fuels create active boundary layers. This is a longleaf pine, one of the most fire-tolerant species in the world. Well, how does it protect that bud when it's burned, over with 600, 700, 800 degree C flames? Well, it actively uses these jets of water vapor from the live fuel around the terminal bud in order to douse out. It's like a built-in sprinkler system, and these kinds of things help us then to make better predictions about fire effects, or certainly explain observations that managers have in the field. Okay, just to close real quick, we know we need more fire, not less, and it's getting harder and harder for those of us in the prescribed fire management field in order to do it because of the complexity of the landscapes that we're burning. Prescribed fire treatments are going to require regional innovation. They're going to need new modeling tools in order to get out of this wildfire trap where we're always chasing our tails and reactive. We've got to get in proactive mode. And in order to burn sophisticated landscapes with confidence, the new tools are going to have to help us change the way we plan for managed fire behavior and smoke. And I firmly believe that these robust fire management science partnerships are going to have to come from the bottom up. There is, again, here no national Center of Excellence for Prescribed Fire, sadly, but the leadership is actually hearing this loose group of managers and researchers that they're hearing how important this is, and funding is starting to arrive. And I'll just end that the idea of shared experience as the bridge has been really so productive in just creating relationships. I can't tell you, when I show up on a fire, some of my manager friends on the incident management team that I work with, they'll say, "Hey, Hires, I want you to apply that model over here. Hey, if I came and asked you this, how does this work?" We literally were looking at we have casual conversations in ways about science that we never would have had before, and they're happening throughout this network that we've created over and over and over again. I'll end with a quick advertisement. I mentioned that we're going to be going to our next burn event's going to be in research burn event's going to be in New Jersey here in September. It was going to be fantastic. The Pine Barrens there is just outside of Philadelphia. We probably are now going to focus on a quick fire modeling exercise. We've done some fire reconstructions up there with them, wildfire, and looking at prescribed burning. And this particular event is going to be open to the public, and probably a training virtual training webinar on quick fire's application and how fast it can run. And so I just wanted to leave this up here as an advertisement of how we're trying to continue this momentum of shared experience, even though we're socially distancing. And with that, I'm happy to kind of go through the chat room and answer any questions.
One of the questions was getting access to the quickfire and the 3D modelling stuff. So I think probably the best thing then, Kevin, is if I can pass your contact details on to those people that were interested, and then they can get in touch with you directly. Would that be the best way to handle that?
That'd be great. And if they can just CC Jason Sharples, he and Rod are in conversation about that as well. We're actually trying to work directly with him on how we take that tool and expand it out. But okay, absolutely, so the 3D fuel is pretty easy though.
Yep.
Go ahead.
So anyone that's online who wants to get in touch with Kevin can email me deb.spark@afax.com.au, and I'll pass that on to Kevin and Jason, and they can liaise back with you. There was another question about getting community buy-in around prescribed burning, and so just wondered if you could give a couple of minutes on your Firefest that you ran earlier in the year and the impact that had at the community level.
Absolutely. During the very difficult fire season we're having, we clearly that's our prescribed fire season here. And in Florida, we were very early adopters of something called Prescribed Fire Awareness Week. It's a state-sponsored week where we promote why we burn in the state like Florida. It's without prescribed fire here, wildfire seasons get out of hand, and those of us that have burned through 1988, 1998, you get the pattern. 2011, every 10 years we have a bad season, and prescribed fire is key to minimizing the risks during those times. But that Prescribed Fire Awareness Week, Tall Timbers decided to make prescribed fire an experiential event for the public as well, in the same way that we've invited managers and researchers to come together on these events that I mentioned today or presented today. The Fire Fest is about presenting those to the public. And we this past year, Deb, I actually don't remember the count that I put in that email, but it was close to 1,300 people that came through and experienced a live prescribed fire, all the wildlife displays we could find of the denizens of the longleaf pine community that we had there. We had food vendors. It was just a big party in overlooking our campus here at Tall Timbers, just north of Tallahassee, Florida. And so being able to reach that many of the public, including a bunch of kids, and just educate them on why we burn, why it's okay to smell a little bit of smoke. It's not harmful in small doses, but most people here know that we burn for a variety of reasons, but increasingly we get a lot of folks that come to the state of Florida that just don't understand why there's smoke in the air. And that's becoming a huge problem. So we've really ramped up that. We're going to start a public relations campaign here as well, just to try to do multimedia push.
Great. What I'm going to do now is open the lines and unmute everybody, so and then they can put their questions directly to you. Just give me one moment.
The conference is now in conversation mode. All participants are now unmuted. The conference is now in presentation mode. All participants are now muted.
Sorry about that. What I might get, I know Tim Wells had a question. It was, after considering fuel variability at fine scales, do you have any comments or observations about the validity of classifying fuel into fuel types? Oh, you may need to press *6 again, Kevin. No, Kevin, if you can hear me, or maybe. Kevin, I'm not hearing you. Can you put in the secret code? Okay, we'll try again. If everyone could please unmute their phones. I know a lot of you would like to put a question to Kevin, so before I open the lines, can everyone please put their phones on mute?
The conference is now in conversation mode. All participants are now unmuted. The conference is now in presentation mode. All participants are now muted.
Sorry everyone, a little bit of a technical issue there, and now I seem to can't get Kevin unmuted either. So what I might do is, if you actually have a question for Kevin, if you could email it to me, Deb, D-E-B, .sparkes, S-P-A-R-K-E-S, @afac.com.au, and I will forward it to Kevin and he can answer it directly. And I think if there are any answers, perhaps he can copy me in on the answers, and if there are any answers, questions and answers that have relevance to everyone, I will put them into the description in the YouTube video when it goes up online. I think I'm just thinking on the run here, but Kevin, I'm just hoping that you can hear me, and I'd like to give you a very big thank you, and I'm sorry about the technical issue. And we, I know that there's been a lot of feedback on the comments there that you can see that people have really enjoyed the webinar, and I'll touch base with you afterwards to debrief. So thank you everyone, and apologies again for that little technical issue in opening the lines. Thank you.